Are you dreaming about travelling again? I bet you are. So give yourself a break and listen to my brand new travel podcast. It's made for people like you, by people like you. And in these podcasts, there will be interviews with different types of travellers and the strange characters that I've met on the road, with stories and anecdotes from the last 32 years of my continuous backpacking and working around the world. Also, there'll be cynical destination descriptions and the occasional travel tip to smooth your journey. And for all the squeamish listeners out there, I just want to say that no studio was used or abused in the making of these podcasts or any of the recordings. So please check it out, and I hope you like it. Oh, and by the way, my name's Alan. This week's podcast is titled Murder on Love Lane, a story from my days travelling around Southeast Asia, and this time from the island of Penang, Malaysia. And it's not every day that you return from Tesco's to find a dead body just laying on the street opposite your hostel. And when I got off the bus on the corner of Julia Street and casually strolled into Love Lane carrying my shopping as usual, it was exactly midday. But I'd forgotten exactly which day it was, but I do remember the temperatures being in the mid-30s, that day and every other day at that time of year. Over the years, Georgetown, on the island of Penang, where this incident happened, has always been well liked by foreigners, especially around the Love Lane and old colonial areas of the city. And Love Lane itself has a lot of history going back many, many years. Being a deep-sea port, the sailors came ashore for a good time, and soldiers too, on their way back from their overseas tours. But now backpackers and tourists flock here from all corners of the world, especially for the famous street food and the cheap lifestyle. People often ask me why it's called Love Lane. Well, there are several theories, but the most common one is that the wealthy Chinese and English businessmen, as well as the aristocrats of the day, are said to have kept their mistresses there, their lovers, which is a quaint way of describing the prostitutes that worked out of the brothels that lined the whole street in the old days. And there's a similar street in Ipoh, another Malaysian town on the mainland, where there's a street called Concubine Lane. When I was there, I knew of only one brothel still operating in Love Lane, a real dodgy place, a cheap flop house during the day, but where ladyboys flicked tricks at night, and possibly still do. But as I said earlier, that was some time ago now. The street has become the heart of the thriving backpacker hostel and guest house scene in Georgetown. But on that fateful day, I saw a scattered group of about half a dozen people or more, some locals and some young tourists, all gathered on the right side of the street, and they all looked shocked and surprised as they stared across the road. My eyes followed their gaze, and was drawn to two policemen standing nonchalantly on the other side, about 2 meters from a body laying on the ground. As I got closer, I could see it was the body of a woman, an umbrella shading her head from the sun rather than the onlookers. As I walked into this scene, I quickly ascertained that the lack of action and no urgency meant that the person lying on the scorching tarmac must be deceased. And as the policemen's backs were turned to me and to the body, I strolled up to have a look. I'll describe exactly what I saw because it differs greatly from the 2 paragraphs in the national Malaysian newspaper, The Star, a couple of days later. She was slim and above average height for a Malaysian. She had long brown hair, just a little longer than her shoulders, but it was now covering her face. She wore a white frilly blouse fastened to the neck, and a simple dark blue ankle-length skirt with small colourful flowers printed on it, primroses I think, and thin black slipper-type shoes that looked more to me like ballet shoes, but I'm not sure. And then I assumed the umbrella, or the parasol in this case, was hers in those blisteringly hot days. And there was a pool of blood by the side of her head. The police casually turned round and saw me standing there, then turned back and continued to talk to each other. I crossed the road and into the hostel, stashing my shopping on my bunk, and went back outside, asking onlookers what had happened and if they'd seen anything of the attack. After chatting to about 3 or 4 different people, I was getting some idea of what took place. Then someone said that the Canadian girl had witnessed it, and he pointed to a girl halfway down the street walking slowly away from the scene. The Canadian girl was about 22, 23, I guess. When I caught up with her, she looked pale and troubled. I asked her if she was okay. She said she was, but she was visibly shaken. It must have been a massive shock. It would have been a shock to anybody. She told me what she saw, and it was pretty horrific. Gathering all these individual accounts together, which were all very similar, I pieced together the events into... Well, let me explain. Apparently, the lady with the parasol had walked about 100 metres into Love Lane when a small motorbike came from the opposite direction. As the rider came level with her, he raised a hammer and swung it, smashing it into her head. Witness also described how an Indian-looking man had then stopped and continued hitting her as she lay on the ground. The usually busy street was no different that day than any other day, and onlookers screamed and shouted at the man to stop, stop. Suddenly he stopped and rode away, turning left into Chulia Street. Once the police had arrived, they taped off the area. The crowd had grown larger now, and 20 minutes later, newspaper reporters and a couple of small-time camera crews turned up, looking for people to interview, all in the scorching afternoon heat. One quick-thinking person had written down the registration number of the bike and gave it to the police, as a siren of an ambulance could be heard in the distance, which eventually raced noisily into Love Lane from the other end. The crew leapt out, bags in hand, ready to aid and assist, but were soon quelled by the police, and then reluctantly climbed back into their vehicle and slipped quietly out the way they came in. By now, the large crowd started thinning as people went back to their daily lives. The press were long gone looking for the next story. More police came and went, as did 3 more ambulances and an undertaker's vehicle. By now you could see the shimmering heat haze rising off the road because it was so hot at 3 o'clock. And still the body lay there roasting on the tarmac. Why hadn't they taken the body away? A doctor's car tooted and parted a small group of spectators that remained there and made his way to the crime scene. He ducked under the tape and spoke to the officers. They all stood around over the body casually talking before he bent down, looked up her skirt for a few seconds, then left. 5 o'clock came and went. Nothing had happened other than the afternoon had started to cool a little as the day slipped into the evening. Less people stopped to look, and nobody seemed to care or have the time to linger now. There were a few more spectators milling around chatting when I went back out onto the street around 6:15. The young backpackers and tourists were now on their way out for the evening meal and a drink, and it seemed that life on Love Lane had almost returned to normal. Yet still the victim lay stretched out on the road, her parasol hiding her face. As I stood there some time later chatting to a friend from the hostel, a dark green Toyota arrived from the far end of the road, its bonnet diving under the police tape in the driver's haste to stop. The driver, possibly in his late 30s, unfolded himself from the car and was possibly the tallest Malaysian I had ever seen. maybe close to 2 meters. But it was what he was wearing that was more interesting, as it consisted of surgeon's green scrubs, half-length white rubber boots, and a thick cream-coloured full-length apron, which made it difficult for him to duck under the tape. And you could see this guy was in a hurry, and from his manners and his actions he was annoyed having to be there. He didn't have any time to waste, and wasn't interested in talking to the single policeman who was now standing guarding the body. Walking straight up to her feet, he grabbed her ankles, lifted them up, spread them wide, then quickly put them back down on the ground. He said something to the policeman, got back into his car and was gone, all in the space of under 2 minutes. Wondering what all that was about, I came to the conclusion that he must work for the mortuary because of his appearance. Less than 10 minutes later, a dark grey funeral vehicle inched its way slowly backwards through the evening twilight. 2 men put the body on a stretcher, slid it into the back of the van and drove away. It was now around 7 o'clock in the evening. After that, the police tape was taken down and the street was once again back to normal. As is often the case, the next day reveals more answers and fills in more blanks. They said that the hammer used in the attack had been found in a dry concrete storm drain along Chulia Street, and the bike registration number had been traced to an Indian living and working in the city. Apparently he was nowhere to be found. The guy working in the 7-Eleven convenience store on the corner said there'd been a very loud argument between the two earlier in the day, in Jalan Pital Tali, a similar road, but it was on the other side of Chulia Street, where working girls and pimps operated at night. Apparently the victim was about 60 years of age, but looked a lot younger, and was originally from the Philippines or Vietnam, but nobody actually knew exactly where. The shop assistant also said that she came in most days to buy cigarettes. He also added that considering how cheap life is around here, he thought it strange that the body lay there for so long. Piecing together what I'd been told, I got a chain of events in my head. So sometime after the argument, the woman walked into Love Lane. The Indian rode around the block, coming into Love Lane via Monterey Street in the opposite direction, hitting the victim so hard it possibly killed her outright, and without warning. And I wondered if it was a crime of passion, or just someone who couldn't handle rejection. Maybe it's all the same thing in the end. And the reason for the body being left there so long, well, that's because here in Malaysia, like in many other countries, if there are any suspicious circumstances surrounding a death, the only person who can authorise the removal is a government coroner. So that's the guy in the apron. My hostel manager gave me the final piece of the puzzle, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. And it made me even more sad after hearing it, because the dead woman was a man. At the beginning of this story, I mentioned the national newspaper, The Star. They sadly mirrored the attitudes of the day by saying that she, the victim, had been dressed in a short miniskirt, a revealing blouse and high-heel shoes, implying she was asking for trouble dressed like that in a Muslim country. But we know the truth, don't we? Well, that's all for this week, folks. And please remember, the same road can be travelled 1,000 different ways, so get out there and make it your own. Until next week.